Hi, everyone. This is Ashley Klein Jimenez with Prevent Connect and Valor US. And I'm here today with my colleague, Tori Vandelin. Hey, Tori, how are you on this bright April day?
This hot April day. I'm good. I've got a nice little iced matcha latte here. Really excited to have this conversation. And it also just hit me when you introduced us, Ashley. This is the first time that we've been able to introduce ourselves on a podcast with our new name.
I was thinking that too. I actually had a moment of, kind of like that anxiety of, oh, wait, I need to say our new name. So yeah, I'm glad that kicked in and I remembered that.
Otherwise, it would have been $1 in the Calcasa jar, which is my version of a swear jar, but it's every time I accidentally call us by our previous name.
Yeah, I have one of those too. I'm not having to put nearly as much in this month as I was last month. But speaking of this month, April is not only is it Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which we have been talking about a lot. We had that great podcast with the National Sexual Violence Resource Center on their SAM 2021 theme about creating safe online spaces. But April's also Child Abuse Prevention Month. And, I think the work that we do, we see sexual assault and child abuse really as going hand in hand. They share a lot of the same risk and protective factors, and a lot of our audience that's working to end sexual violence is also working to end child sexual abuse as well.
I see what you're saying, that folks who are preventing sexual violence are often doing so across the lifespan. And I think sometimes, I don't know if it's a forgetting thing or just like a change in the language, but when we're talking about preventing sexual violence among youth, we're also preventing child sexual abuse, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for putting words to my thoughts. I appreciate that. And so, that makes me think of, because that work is happening across the lifespan, and many people who are working to prevent child sexual abuse and sexual violence, later in life, are doing so with lots of resources and learnings from one another. We are actually in a really unique place where we get to see a lot of what those resources and what those shared learning opportunities look like. And so I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about what some of those existing resources are that we've come to know about.
I know that when I first joined the Prevent Connect team, there were so many child sexual abuse prevention resources that were on Prevent Connect or that I found through Prevent Connect that I had never seen in my days working in sexual violence prevention in a college environment. And it was, really cool to see how Prevent Connect was really making those connections for folks. And so, Ashley, I think one of the first things that caught my eye was the Power in Prevention series that Prevent Connect did with the Miss Foundation a few years ago. So I know that that was before my time. I think it might have been a little before you had joined the Prevent Connect team too. So I'm excited to hear from David an overview of that series and like what the key takeaways for child sexual abuse prevention are.
Yeah, Tori, I came in, I think, right at the end of that series. So I was only involved for, maybe a handful of those web conferences, but I definitely was a part of the audience for many of them over the years, and learned so much. So I'm excited to hear from David.
Prevent Connect has always been dedicated to being able to prevent violence across the lifespan. And this means that our focus on prevention includes a prevention on preventing child sexual abuse. In 2012, Prevent Connect received funding from the Ms. Foundation for Women to be able to host our Power and Prevention Ending Child Sexual Abuse web conference series. For the next many years, with that funding and other sources, Prevent Connect has hosted over 30 web conferences on how to be able to prevent child sexual abuse. What we've learned during these has been how we can think about ways to change environments to be able to create the place where sexual violence is less likely. Early in my career in the 1980s, I was doing child sexual abuse prevention programs in the schools. In those days, we were focusing on the work we would do with children and sort of putting the responsibility, in effect, the responsibility for preventing onto them. What we've done is seen a shift in child sexual abuse prevention programs to look at the ways that adults and institutions can take responsibility to create situations that are less likely for sexual violence to take place. And so what we're doing is we're highlighting those strategies that we can be able to create protective environments where sexual violence won't take place, and to be able to reduce the likelihood that such will take place, about establishing policies, about procedures to have in place, and to be able to highlight how we can be able to make that change. The other big theme that we learned through our Power and Prevention series and through the work where we were featuring programs from the Just Beginnings collaboratives was the important role of survivors, including adult survivors, in being able to take leadership and taking action to be able to prevent sexual violence. And those voices are essential in being able to effectively be able to prevent child sexual abuse. We at Prevent Connect are dedicated to continuing doing child sexual abuse prevention, to be able to think about how we're going to be able to support making the changes in our society so we can live in a society without child sexual abuse. I encourage you to go check out these recordings to learn about all the great work that was done in schools, in faith communities, within sport, within youth serving organizations, and the different roles that each of us can play to be able to prevent child sexual abuse. Together we have been, and will make a difference in being able to create our world that's going to be free from sexual violence.
The great thing about the Power and Prevention series is that even though, you know, that series is something that happened, you know, in the past, we have all of those recordings and all of the materials, and those are still available on Prevent Connect. And obviously, this topic is one that we care deeply about, and so while this specific series might not be happening anymore, that's not to say that the issue of child sexual abuse and preventing child sexual abuse won't happen on Prevent Connect, because it is happening. We have been doing web conferences around this issue still. And Tori, I don't know if you, in your work, because you did work, you know, so closely on college campuses, but back in 2007, CDC released a document called Preventing Child Sexual Abuse Within Youth Serving Organizations, Getting Started on Policies and Procedures. And I remember it being such an important document, not just for youth serving organizations, but really for anyone who was working in the field of violence prevention. And, you know, I think one of the reasons why it was so important was because it provided some really concrete components that organizations could really look to implement as part of their efforts to keep youth safe. And so I'm wondering, when did you come across this document? Was it when you came to Prevent Connect, or had you seen it before?
It actually was when I came to Prevent Connect, and you know, you're totally right. The processes that are in that document would have been so helpful, even in the environment that I was working in, with majority of folks who are 18 and older. And I think that's a real strength of us having this conversation, and of the way that the field has changed in the last few years, where folks are making more of those connections of like, okay, so here are things that folks used in like the child sexual abuse prevention realm, how can we also use that when we're talking to adults to prevent sexual violence?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I mean, I think one of the kind of like main points of that document was how do we create environments that are meant to do what they were originally envisioned to do. So when we think about like youth serving organizations, for example, you know, those are places for young people, for kids, for youth to have fun, to learn, to build relationships, peer relationships, but also to connect with healthy and caring, positive adult relationships. And so how do we create environments where those are the things that are happening rather than sexual violence or sexual abuse? And so I think that those learnings can be applied in various settings and situations.
And Ashley, when you're talking about youth serving organizations, that made me think of the e-learning unit that you have on Prevent Connect's e-learning site. And one of the things you say in there always really stood out to me of like, who is a youth serving organization, like who views themselves as a youth serving organization. And then thinking of the prevention environments that I was in prior to my time here, I'm thinking like, you know, even on a college campus where most of your students are 18 and older, that in a lot of ways is also still a youth serving organization because you have like those summer youth camps or you know, are hosting high school students for like campus tours and things like that. So it kind of just made me rethink like, you know, when you first think of a youth serving organization, I think of like the summer camps I went to as a kid. I think of like you know, Big Brother, Big Sister, YMCA, things like that. But I think it's also really expansive to think about, you know, the organizations that serve youth too, as like another section of the work that they do.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I mean, the youth serving organizations can be really broad, and I think that we should think about them broadly. Because I think like you do, you know, my first thought would go to, you know, something that youth do after school, but are schools not youth serving organizations, right? So when we start to think more expansively, like you said, then I think we start to see that these policies, these practices can really apply to settings that youth move throughout on any, you know, given day or time in their lives. And I'm glad that you mentioned the Prevent Connect e-learning unit because we really did take that 2007 CDC document and created an interactive lesson that was really meant to walk youth serving organizations through these considerations in developing child sexual abuse prevention policies. And we ended up adding 2 additional components that we thought were really important. So I think we did this e-learning unit in 2018. So, you know, over 10 years had passed since CDC originally had released that report. And what we added was implementing technology-based prevention policies. And gosh, it's almost like we could see 2020 coming or something. And then the second component that we added was engaging leaders and board members to be part of the solution to ending child sexual abuse, because it really is important that child sexual abuse and preventing child sexual abuse becomes an issue that people are committed to taking seriously, you know, from every aspect of an organization, whether you are employed, whether you are a volunteer, whether you are on the board of directors. That is something that is really important. And so the course that we ended up creating is really intended for all sorts of people working or having some type of interaction with a youth serving organization. So anyone from advocates to prevention practitioners to faculty and instructors to mentors and coaches, staff, administrators, anyone who's representing or working in youth serving organizations and who are committed to being able to identify and implement policies that will prevent child sexual abuse. This e-learning unit is really for all of those people.
I really like how you bring up that, everybody, we often say this with sexual violence prevention, but it's also true for child sexual abuse prevention, because it's also sexual violence prevention. Everyone has a role to play, no matter where they're at in an organizational structure. That everyone who interacts with youth has a role to play in keeping youth safe and keeping the organization safe too. You were talking a little bit about this organizational culture and how can folks change that. And that made me think, because of one of the key takeaways of our Just Beginnings collaborative series. So gosh, this was COVID brain. I don't even know how many years ago. This was like 2 or 3 years ago at this point, where we did a 3-part series with fellows from the Just Beginnings Collaborative about preventing child sexual abuse. And so one of the web conferences was about adult survivors as movement leaders. One was about community organizing and mobilizing, and another was about culture change in organizations and in churches too. So I just remember that series being, such a great way to tie social justice and child sexual abuse prevention, and just gave so many great examples of the work that folks have already done to prevent child sexual abuse within their own communities. I remember Suget Lopez of Líderes Campesinas talking about the art-based community mobilizing that they were doing to engage youth and adults in their communities. I also remember a lot of what Aisha Shaida Simmons talked about with accountability and humanity, and not demonizing folks. Because I remember from being a youth that a lot of the ways that folks talked about child sexual abuse was very like the movie Lovely Bones, or the book Lovely Bones, if people have read that, where it's Stanley Tucci's character is the creepy neighbor, and that's the only way that child sexual abuse happens. But what I really appreciated from Aisha and talking about her work with love with accountability is the need not to demonize people, but to not only bring survivors their whole humanity, but also recognizing the humanity of people who cause harm. And because that is a way that we learn how to prevent child sexual abuse. Sonia Shaw talked about that a lot too, about working with people who have perpetrated child sexual abuse or other kinds of sexual violence, and learning from them, what would it have taken to not have this happen? What would it have taken to prevent this violence from happening in the first place? And I just remember that being such a transformational conversation. A lot of the conversation too focused on, centering the wisdom of those who are most impacted by child sexual abuse. I feel like a lot of the times when we talk about child sexual abuse prevention, like we are right now, we're two adults talking about it, and there's a lot of wisdom from adult survivors, but also what do youth feel will keep them safe? So there were a lot of really great gems from that 3-part web conference series. And so, again, the Power in Prevention series with the MISS Foundation, all of those recordings are still available on our website. All of the slides are still available on our website. And we also wrote a brief summary of all of the web conferences too. So that is also available online for folks who only have 15-20 minutes versus, what would it be? 4.5 hours of watching web conference recordings.
Yeah, Tori, I remember that series and just felt so honored to get to hear from our guests and have them share about the work that they're engaged in and work that's happening in and with communities. And it's a hard topic talking about child sexual abuse. And at the same time, I walked away from those web conferences feeling really hopeful and feeling like, wow, like there's so many just like smart and passionate and dedicated people to combating this and looking at it from different, perspectives as well. And so I think that the fact that we have those written summaries makes some of that learning so much more shareable. And I'm really grateful that we are able to be in conversation with them.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It's difficult to talk about child sexual abuse, especially over a whole series. That's a lot of talking about child sexual abuse. But I think what made that series so special was the way that the presenters really, inspired that hope in everyone. And it was honestly just so cool to hear about all of the prevention successes they've had, from working, directly with folks in their communities, working with different organizations, working with the youth in their lives too. It was really fascinating.
Absolutely. I agree. What about, things that are kind of are emerging, things that are on the horizon or that we're hearing about? I actually can share that, and we posted about this on our blog, and it's still, this opportunity is still available, but I did just want to mention that the CDC Foundation and an organization called Applied Curiosity Research, they are currently speaking with youth-serving organizations across the country, and are really interested in learning how those organizations are approaching keeping children safe and preventing child sexual abuse. And the feedback that they receive will go into creating new resources from CDC in order to help youth-serving organizations prevent child sexual abuse and really create the environments that are safe, stable, nurturing. And something that I think is really important is that they are intentionally looking for feedback from youth-serving organizations that serve 5 specific communities, and those are LGBTQ plus youth experiencing homelessness, immigrant and refugee populations, Indigenous and tribal communities, and then children with different abilities. And so we'll make sure that there's a link, but they are currently looking for youth-serving organizations right now to hear from, so that can really inform new resources that may be coming from CDC in the future.
That's so awesome. And I hope that our listeners have an opportunity to provide their input, because I know that our audience has a lot of wisdom in it. Ashley, we've been talking for a while. What do you say about wrapping up this episode and inviting our audience to come back for part 2 and hear about some emerging resources?
Sounds great, Tori. It's been fun chatting.
Yeah, same here. Thanks for listening. Part 2 of this podcast is available now, linked on our website.